historians share a common trait of being good storytellers. And I have had the opportunity of hearing Dr. O'Keefe speak before, and I think you will find that he also is a very effective storyteller about things that we should all be interested in, about the American Revolution in particular. So put your hands together and welcome Dr. O'Keefe.
All right, well, thank you for coming out here this afternoon on a Friday. So today I'm going to talk about something that has been the focus of my research for a long time now. So back when I started grad school, I got into studying the Loyalists in the American Revolution, or the colonists who were in favor of staying part of the British Empire, who were not in favor of breaking away. This part of my research really looks at loyalists after the American Revolution, the ones who try to reintegrate into American society once the war is over. I think if you ask most Americans how many civil wars have we had, most people are going to tell you one, and I would say that's actually not right, because there really have been two civil wars. The American Revolution was in itself, in a way, a civil war. It wasn't just American versus British. There were colonists of all sorts of political ideologies, including those who wanted to remain loyal to the British Empire. And this first Civil War ends with the question of, what to do with the Loyalists at the end of the Revolution. What happens to them? And so this is, in some ways, a study in what you might call conflict resolution, if you're thinking about a more like academic term. And overall, I want to explain how and why this case of conflict resolution is actually really, really successful. And that's really the through line throughout this story, is that the first American Civil War ends actually quite peacefully, much more so than the second one does. So whenever you pick up a research project, as you know, you have research questions. You're trying to answer big questions. So some of mine coming into this topic, what happens after a civil war? How do nations reintegrate dissidents? How do people forgive one another after years of conflict? And then specifically, what role do the people who oppose the creation of the United States have in the new republic? Most, but not all of this talk is going to focus on New York, because that is where I've done most of my research, and my dissertation, which will in a few months be my book, was on loyalists in the Hudson Valley in particular. So that's going to be like the main focus, but I will draw in other examples as I go through as well. So starting with some overview, the Revolutionary War begins in 1775 with the shots at Lexington and Concord. It launches an 8-year-long conflict between Britain, the United States, Loyalists. Eventually, France and Spain will get involved. Native American nations will get involved later in the war. From the very beginning of the war, there are Americans who aren't really on board with what is going on, and these are the Loyalists. Their numbers probably grow after about 15 months of fighting, when the colonies declare independence, and you have the creation of the United States, and there's really no turning back at that point. There's some disagreement on how large the Loyalist population was, but a common estimate is somewhere around 15 to 20%. That's like a ballpark estimate that historians frequently give. That doesn't mean, though, that 80 or 85% of the population comprised of patriots, because there are many people who fall somewhere in the middle. There may have been as many people who were ambivalent or not really on either side as there were patriots, depending on what breakdown you want to go with. Historians have different estimates. Loyalists are also not spread evenly throughout the colonies. There are Loyalists in every single colony, but by and large, I would say, broadly speaking, there tend to be more Loyalists in the middle colonies, particularly in places like New York and New Jersey, and also in the Carolinas, and less so in Virginia and New England. Loyalist experiences are very diverse, but I'd say broadly speaking, there is like escalating persecution of Loyalists as the war goes on. Revolutionary authorities try to crack down on loyalists. They view them as a subversive internal force, view them as a potential fifth column. Many are jailed. There are acts of violence against loyalists. Others are just simply ostracized from their communities. Of the many acts of violence, I figured I'd give like one sort of case study in that. I'm going to talk about a guy named Thomas Brown in Georgia. He was a 25-year-old near Augusta, Georgia. He refused to sign what is called the association, which is really just something you signed to say you were on board of the revolution, you were happy with what the Continental Congress is doing, you'd abide by the orders of the Continental Congress. Local patriots weren't okay with Brown refusing to sign this association. They came to his house, began harassing him. Brown grabs a gun to protect himself. The mob lunges at him, end up knocking him out. They hit him over the head with the butt of their muskets. They tie him to a tree, and they decide to beat him and set his feet on fire. And eventually his toes are burned off into stubs, and they pour hot tar over him as a punishment as well. And they rip his hair out to scalp him. That's a very extreme example, but it's not unheard of. Like those kinds of violence, those kinds of acts of violence happened throughout the colonies during the war. He actually survived that. Loyalists did not always survive that kind of harassment and violence, but he was fortunate enough to survive and became a big Loyalist military leader in the Southern campaign. In response to this escalating persecution as the war goes on, many Loyalists are going to take refuge in British-occupied cities. So Britain throughout the war has a hard time controlling the countryside, but they are able to control all the large cities on the eastern seaboard. So the 5 largest cities in the colonies at the time of independence are Boston, Newport, Rhode Island, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. And Britain controls all of those at different points during the war. And they become something as havens for Loyalist refugees who are fleeing from this persecution in the countryside. Once behind British lines, many Loyalists begin organizing into provincial regiments. These are just Loyalist regiments that are serving alongside the British Army during the conflict. They become an especially important player in the war starting in 1778 because France joins the conflict, which means Britain has to defend its colonies across the world, not just to deal with this North American rebellion. And so they can spare fewer troops to America, and they try to offset that shortage of troops by employing more Loyalists at their service. So you see Loyalists, for example, that flee to New York City, that form Loyalist regiments, like James Delancey here, who is a military officer. There are Loyalists that flee into British Florida, which is British, not Spanish in this period, and regiments that form there and go and fight in Georgia and the Carolinas. In New York in particular, there are Loyalists that are driven out and take refuge in Canada, form regiments there, and launch devastating attacks into upstate New York and western Pennsylvania. And so many of the areas around these cities and on the frontiers are really the scenes of an intense civil war, especially in the latter years of the conflict between Loyalist regiments, Loyalist militias, Continental Army, and then Patriot militia on the other side. And the Civil War is particularly bad in New York, New Jersey, Carolinas, and Georgia. So throughout the war, there's anti-Loyalist legislation passed in every single state. There is no exception to that. What I have on the screen here are anti-Loyalist laws passed in New York by 1784. These are not all of them. These are just some of the big ones. There were a lot. I couldn't fit them all into one slide. So banned from voting. If you were a Loyalist, you weren't allowed to vote. Banned from holding public office. You couldn't be a lawyer. Your real and personal property was confiscated. There were 59 prominent Loyalists who are attainted. The New York State Legislature passes a bill of attainder, which is really just when the legislature says you're guilty. You don't have a trial. There's no jury trial or anything. The legislature says you're guilty. If you were a family with Loyalist sons, you were taxed extra. And it also becomes legal to prosecute loyalists for misprision of treason, which was a term I had never heard of until I started this research, and I had to look up to make sure that was a real word, which it is. It just means the purposeful concealment of a treasonable act. So if you know somebody's committing treason and you help hide it, or you yourself commit treason and you hide it, you could be prosecuted for that. So these laws encompass a lot of different actions. This is going to affect basically every single loyalist. At least some of these laws will affect every single loyalist in New York. And this is just New York, but if you look at other states, you would have seen some differences, but overall pretty broad similarities in the kinds of laws that are being passed. So in 1783, the war ends. U.S. and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. This ends the conflict. And in the negotiations, the British commissioners had wanted to get a better deal for the Loyalists, but the American commissioners, led by Benjamin Franklin, were not accepting of that. You might have noticed I had an earlier slide. Benjamin Franklin's son was a Loyalist, so he had a personal stake in this struggle. And so all the treaty says is that Congress had to, quote unquote, earnestly recommend to the states that they would return confiscated property, stop prosecutions, protect loyalists, and so on. So earnestly recommend is not very binding language, and loyalists knew that. Congress could recommend to the states to do whatever, and the states could do whatever they wanted. Congress is pretty weak. And so loyalists recognize that there is basically no protections for them in the peace treaty, and so a whole host of things could happen to them now that the war is over. So loyalists have two main options with the war being over. One is they could leave, and there are a lot of loyalists who do this. So the most common place they could go to was what becomes Canada. Canada back then really means what's now the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, but also Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which later joined Canada, are also common places loyalists can go. If you go there, you can get free land from Great Britain. Some Southern loyalists will go down to Jamaica, Bahamas. Some free black loyalists will end up going to initially to Nova Scotia and then West Africa. Somewhere around 60,000 loyalists are going to leave. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but that's actually a pretty large number considering the population at the time. But despite this option, despite the possibility of free land elsewhere in the British Empire, most loyalists are going to choose to reintegrate. They're going to choose to stay in the United States and try to reintegrate. Those who leave are the ones who are generally most ideologically committed to the British Empire. And most people, though, are not quite that ideological. They don't want to begin their life over again somewhere that they don't know. Many of them had lost faith in the British as the war went on. There's this view among loyalists, the British just bungled the war away. They made a bunch of mistakes. They should have won. So why do we even want to remain in the British Empire when they couldn't do anything right in the Revolutionary War? There are many challenges to reintegrating. One are the laws I already laid out. Another big one is there's just a lot of widespread hostility to loyalists who are going to either stay in their communities or return from British-occupied cities to their homes. Patriots tended to blame loyalists for the violence of the war. They called them murderers, robbers, thieves. Loyalists are not legitimate political actors in the eyes of revolutionaries. They view them as traitors to the nation. And so there's this tendency throughout the war to try to frame them as criminals. So these are not just like honorable enemies. They're criminals. They're uncivilized. And because many loyalists who had gone to Canada during the war and end up attacking the New York frontier, because many of them serve alongside Native Americans, there's a tendency to also depict white loyalists as race traitors for aligning with American Indians against the United States. So as the war is winding down, and the British are preparing to evacuate the places they still control, all across the colonies, patriots meet in the different committees and meetings, and they publish resolutions in the newspapers warning loyalists they are not welcome to come home. For example, one published in New York in 1782 warned that they would, quote, extirpate from this precinct all such who have joined the enemy and shall attempt to return hither in the future. They resolved that no loyalists would be allowed within the community's boundaries. Any state laws protecting loyalists would be ignored. But I think the most chilling one that I found that comes from New York was passed in Cambridge, which is a small community near Albany, New York. They resolved that anybody who entered the community had to carry a certificate of patriotism to prove that they had been committed to the revolution. And they also resolved that a sign be erected on each road entering the district that said, "Ye enemies to American independence, take heed to the following. Turks, pagans, Jews, 'tis a true story, may enter here before a Tory. The many crimes by them committed prevents their being here admitted." Tory being the derogatory term for loyalist. And that's what you see in this image on the screen. There are also more than just threats of violence. There is violence itself. So one man named Joshua Booth tried to return to his home in Orange County, New York in October 1783. He ends up being seized by a mob who shaves off his head, tear off his eyebrows, they tar and feather him, they force him to wear a sheepskin hat, they put a cowbell around his neck and put a paper on his forehead which said, "Look, yo Tory crew, and see what George your king can do." Thomas McDaniel, whose account is on the screen, goes through a similar ordeal. He's from Dutchess County, New York. He also tries to return home at the end of the war. When he gets home, a group of 8 men seizes him, they drag him away, they tie him to a post, they beat him over and over, lashing him on the back. And when the beating ceases, they tell him he needs to get out or they'll come back and beat him again. He spends several days recovering from his injuries and then realizes he doesn't want to stay in New York anymore. So he actually writes this account, what you see on the screen here, to the British general as the British are preparing to evacuate New York City. And he begs him to be allowed to go to Nova Scotia rather than risk attack again. And I was lucky enough to come across this when I was doing research in London right before the pandemic hit, January 2020. There's evidence that prosecutions continue in the immediate aftermath of the war. The peace treaty says that Congress has to earnestly recommend the states stop prosecutions, but New York ignores that and continues prosecuting loyalists. Patriots tend to justify this treatment by saying that loyalists were barbarians during the war, that they would contaminate Republican government, lowercase r Republican government, if allowed into the body politic. And in New York in particular, it's very hard to move past the struggle, move past loyalism, because the conflict in New York as a civil war lasts longer than anywhere else. The British occupied New York City very early in the war, which really launches the Civil War in New York, and it just goes on for 7 years. It happens, there are intense periods of civil war fighting across the colonies, but it just lasts in New York longer than anywhere else, making it especially hard to forgive loyalists. What you see on the image here is a print that I really like because it gives you an idea of some of the thought about what's going on with loyalists in the colonies or the United States at the time. And what you see is actually done by a British sympathizer to loyalists who feels like Britain has abandoned them. And he shows Native Americans who are meant to be American revolutionaries massacring loyalists in the aftermath of the war. That they're being executed, they're being lynched, they're being killed. It gives you a sense of some of the terror that loyalists feel right as the war is coming to an end. So there are all these obstacles to loyalist reintegration. And the biggest thing loyalists really have to do is they need to convince patriots that they were honorable in their opposition. This is almost like a strategy they fall on, that they want to emphasize that they were honorable in their opposition to the revolution and to emphasize that they themselves weren't actually violent. They try to distance themselves from the violence of the wars. Like the ones who went to Canada, they were violent, but we're not violent. We didn't commit any atrocities during the war. We disagreed with you, but we didn't commit any atrocities. One way they try to sort of push this argument is by relying on friends and family from before the war, family who they were, people who they're related to. They try to use them as sort of guides to get back into New York society as accepted members. A prominent example of this is Peter Van Schack, who was a very moderate loyalist, I would say, from upstate New York. He ends up refusing to take an oath of allegiance to the revolutionary government during the war. He's banished behind British lines, and from there he eventually moves to England, and he remains there for a few years. While he's in England, though, he reaches out to his old friend, a famous founding father named John Jay. He and John Jay had attended King's College, now Columbia University, together. And he basically apologizes to John Jay. He says that he acted from the best of motives, he had been misguided in his actions, but it had been well-intentioned. And he apologizes for what he calls the, quote, errors of my heart. Jay comes to accept Van Schack's argument and agrees that Van Schack and a good number of other loyalists don't act from bad motives. They were misguided, but they were well-intentioned. And Van Schack himself, because he never takes up arms for the British, is easier for Jay to forgive, and also because they're longtime friends. So Jay accepts Van Schack's explanation and his apology, saying that, quote, as an independent American, I considered all who were not for us, and you among the rest, as against us. Yet be assured that John Jay did not cease to be a friend to Peter Van Schack. And so they kind of build a bridge to get past this big political disagreement they had during the war. Jay helps Van Schack reintegrate over the next few years. He keeps Van Schack informed on affairs in New York. He gives him intelligence on saying things like, don't come back right now, things are still really dangerous. But by 1785, 1786, Jay tells Van Schack, I think you'll be okay if you come back. Now, I think things have cooled down enough that if you want to return, things will be okay. And when Van Schack does return from England, Jay greets him on the dock when the boat arrives, introduces him to the governor of New York, George Clinton, and ends up pulling some strings in the New York State legislature to get them to pass a bill restoring Van Schack's citizenship so he can vote again. This is just one example, and it's a very high-profile example because John Jay is an extremely significant figure, but it gives you an idea of what some loyalists try to do. They apologize, they say they weren't involved in the violence of the war, and they also tend to stress that loyalty is a virtue. They say, yes, we were loyal, but we were loyal to Great Britain, and we're so loyal to them that loyalty will now be to you. We will be just as loyal to the new nation as we were to Great Britain. By 1785, 1786, a lot of the hostility directed towards loyalists begins to cool down quite a bit. There are many cases of loyalists returning from Canada to visit friends and family. The prosecutions begin to go away. Many of the laws that were passed to discriminate against loyalists, they're just kind of ignored. People begin to ignore them by the late 1780s. So, for example, I've found loyalists who were in elected government by the late 1780s, usually at the town level, not at high-level office, but at the town level, you begin finding loyalists who are reelected to local government in violation of state laws. And then beginning in 1786 and continuing to 1792, the legislature just begins repealing many of these laws that it had passed during and immediately after the war. And they're repealing them oftentimes by a margin of like 2-1 or 3-1 in the legislature. It's not even that particularly close in the legislature. So in 1788, they repealed the law that prohibited loyalists from voting. And then in 1792, they repealed the Bill of Attainder, which had banished loyalists from a number of loyalists from the state, and also said if they came back, they would be executed. They repealed that in 1792, which is what you see on the screen here. So like, why was this reintegration so quick? There's like this intense hostility to loyalists right as the war ends and the first couple years after, but then it kind of goes away pretty quickly. And that was something, as I was doing my research, that kind of bothered me because it's a very quick turnabout. You have this intense hostility and then it just kind of dissipates within a few years. And I think at least part of the reason is what I explained with sort of this community-centered integration approach with like what Van Schack does with Jay. But you can also say that about any civil war. There are relationships that exist across any group of people through any civil war. And so I felt like there had to be additional explanations. And I think there are a few others that I want to go through in the next, 20 minutes or so. So I think at least part of the reason is there's a big shift in the national political environment during the mid-1780s, right around the time that there is this growing acceptance of loyalists once again. So if you are a little bit familiar with this era of American history, the US is operating under the Articles of Confederation, which is a very weak central government. It largely gives sovereignty to the states. Most importantly, Congress has no power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. There's lots of instability. The most famous case is Shays' Rebellion, which is an armed uprising in western Massachusetts by middling farmers who feel like they're basically being mistreated by elites in Massachusetts. So there's a shift in the national conversation in the mid-1780s to really about what the government should be. People like James Madison, and George Washington think that there's actually too much democracy in the states, that these legislatures in the states, they're just at the whims of like the mob. The mob has control of the legislatures. They're too democratic. They're too susceptible to popular opinion. And in a lot of ways, they want to create a stronger national government to try to check the power of the states, to centralize more power in a national government that can prevent almost like excessive democracy in the states that risks tearing the country apart. So in a lot of ways, the US Constitution is really like I would say a backlash to the Articles of Confederation, which is in some ways more democratic. And it's almost like a conservative reaction in a lot of respects to what the founders view or the framers view as too much democracy at the state level. So in pushing for a stronger central government, former loyalists are actually a natural ally. So a lot of the supporters of a stronger national government, the Federalists, they see loyalists as supporters, like potential supporters of a stronger national government. Most former loyalists are in support of the Constitution. They have more conservative impulses. They value hierarchy. They don't like the instability that came with the war. One of the biggest loyalist attacks on revolutionaries is that they're creating anarchy. And that's actually one of the things you hear from like Madison and Washington, that there's anarchy in the states. There's just all this chaos. And so loyalists are just a natural ally to these Federalists who want to create a stronger national government in the aftermath of the revolution. So as a result, Federalists are particularly sympathetic to loyalists and do a lot to try to promote their reintegration. In New York, Robert Troup, who's a New York Federalist, he later noted that former loyalists had, quote, manfully fought by our side in every important battle, and we ought not to forget their zealous and useful services in our great contest for the Constitution. In New York, you even have some former loyalists who run as candidates for the Poughkeepsie Convention, which is the ratifying convention to determine whether or not New York will ratify the Constitution. And New York is a very, very divided state. It comes very close to not ratifying the Constitution. And the only reason it does is that Virginia and New Hampshire had done it shortly before. And so it basically already was it was already in effect. And so New York didn't want to be left out of the Union. But otherwise, it probably would have rejected the Constitution. And it's loyalists in part, former loyalists, who help give some more public support to ratifying the Constitution in New York. Alexander Hamilton is another prominent Federalist who pushes for Loyalist reintegration. So Hamilton was practicing as a lawyer in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. He serves in the Army, serves in Congress for a while, and then ends up as an active lawyer in New York City. And he takes on the Trespass Act, which was not one of the laws I included on my slide earlier. But the Trespass Act basically says that if you are a patriot and you live somewhere in the war and then you were forced out by the British, and then during the war someone lived on that property, you can sue them for the time they lived on your property. And the people who lived on the property in British occupied areas are going to be loyalists because you wouldn't have patriots living behind British lines. Now this, again, goes directly against the peace treaty, which says that the states are not supposed to prosecute loyalists. And so Hamilton takes on this case, Rutgers versus Waddington, when a patriot tries to sue a loyalist who was using her property in New York City, in British occupied New York City during the war. And the end result's kind of a split decision. Hamilton doesn't fully win. But Hamilton is, he's advocating for loyalists. He thinks that it is a very bad message to the world that the U.S. is just flaunting the peace treaty by continuing to prosecute loyalists in the aftermath of the war. Another way loyalists influence the Constitution is through the Bill of Attainder. So I mentioned this a couple times already, but bills of attainder are when, like, the legislature can say, this group of people or this person, they are found guilty, and they give them a punishment. So New York does that. Many other states do that to loyalists during the war. And so a lot of the framers and Federalists are really worried about property rights. And again, they're worried about the actions of what they consider to be tyrannical legislatures. And a too democratic process where it's like people want to convict somebody of a crime and the legislature does it because they're very susceptible to popular opinion, which is kind of what happens. Like states like New York do not pass Bill of Attainders until later in the war. And when they do it, it's because they're under a lot of pressure from the population at large. It wants vengeance on the loyalist population. So as a result, there's pretty strong evidence that because of this concern, no Bill of Attainders is one of the only protections in the text of the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights comes a couple years later. But in the text of the U.S. Constitution, this clause on prohibiting bills of attainder is specifically tied to the fact that it was weaponized against loyalists during the war. And the framers view it as something kind of as a correction for what was excessive sovereignty seized by state legislatures during the war. Beyond the Federalist part, I do think there are other reasons as well why loyalists reintegrate pretty successfully. One is that there's a clear outlet for people who are really ideological, and that outlet is British North America, what we now call Canada. So many revolutions are civil wars, but they don't always have a logical place for the losers to go. In the case of the American Revolution, there is a place they can go where they can kind of do their own thing, stay part of the British Empire, live under similar institutions. At least 60,000 loyalists leave. That's a more conservative estimate. Some are a bit higher than that, but 60,000, I'd say, is an accepted conservative estimate of how many loyalists left the US. That might not sound like a lot. It's only like double the population of Independence County. But when you put it in the percentage of the population at the time, that's about 2.5% of the population and would equate to somewhere around 7 to 8 million Americans today by modern standards. And I think in the US, if we could take the 8 million most ideological people and put them somewhere else, our politics would probably be very different. And that's kind of what happens in the American Revolution, is you take the most ideological people and they have somewhere to go. So look at the French Revolution, for example, that's not really what happens. There are people who leave France, but proportionally it's much less than who leave the United States. And so as a result, the French Revolution devolves into the series of bloody civil wars of the 1790s that really doesn't stop until Napoleon takes control. And even then, there's still unrest after that. So the loyalists who leave, who go to Canada, are much more likely to be the ideologues, and the loyalists who stay are much more likely to have been more moderate. They certainly were loyalists, but they're not quite as ideological and are a little bit more open to accepting a new Republican government, even if they hadn't supported it. And if you look at the governments that the loyalists do establish in Canada, historians often call them counter-revolutionary governments because they're set up in a way that tries to correct for all the mistakes the British thought they had made. Like, they're very aristocratic, very governor-dominated, very weak legislatures, very restricted voting rights. They try to limit democracy to just a very, very small part of society in Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick after the Revolution. I think another major reason reintegration is effective is that it has to do with demographics. So if you study who loyalists were, what you ultimately discover is that they're really not any different than who patriots were. You find loyalists who are wealthy. You find loyalists who are poor. You find loyalists who are of all different religious groups. You find loyalists of different ethnic groups. There's not clear ethnic, religious, class divides between loyalists and patriots. And there also aren't that many geographic patterns. There are some very broad geographic patterns. Like I said, in the middle colonies in the South, lower South tend to have more loyalists. But as a whole, every colony has loyalists, every town, every neighborhood. And during the war, the way that patriots really distinguish themselves from loyalists is that loyalists are violent barbarians. But being a violent barbarian isn't an immutable characteristic. That's something that can kind of change how you view somebody. I think when differences are really tied to ethnicity, religion, things like that, which are basically immutable characteristics, it's much harder to move past conflict. And because that just isn't how the breakdown happens in the revolution, it's easier to reintegrate people who you share a lot in common with than people who you consider as a different group. And it's because loyalists as a whole are demographically very similar to patriots, it becomes very hard to otherize them. Once the war ends and loyalists mostly accept that, this is how things are now, we have a new Republican government in town. So if we compare it to the other American Civil War, the 1860s Civil War, it's very different. Like the American Civil War, obviously is a huge geographic divide. It's North versus South, so that's an immutable characteristic. You're from the North, you're from the South. The border states are a mess, but from the North, you're probably pro-Union. If you're a white Southerner, you're probably pro-Confederate. And then obviously race is a huge component of the Civil War, another immutable characteristic. And I think because those issues that you see, Reconstruction is much more violent than what happens after the American Revolution. There's no one magical moment when loyalists are fully reintegrated, but I think you could say by 1790, about 7 years after the war, they're effectively full citizens again. They're voting, they're in public office, they're serving on juries. They're pretty clearly full citizens of society once more. Things are going so well for loyalists that there is actually a movement of some loyalists from Canada back into the US. What you see here is a letter written by Sarah Hyatt to her son Nathaniel, telling him he should come home, saying it was, quote, her earnest desire of your returning to your native home as all matters of war appears to be done away with. Most loyalists don't come back from Canada, but a good minority actually do, and they also pretty effectively reintegrate once they return. It's still evident, though, that even though reintegration is successful, many loyalists do still suffer from the scars of war. Very few loyalists are in a high political office after the war. They're just not that interested in being involved in it. I found many accounts of loyalists saying, I don't want to get involved in politics again. I had a very bad experience first time around. Isaac Wilkins is one case of that. He's a loyalist during the war. It's a British-occupied New York City, goes to Nova Scotia, spends a bunch of time there. He's in the assembly in Nova Scotia for a while. Comes back later on, and when somebody recommends that he get back involved in politics, he says, quote, "I have never published anything relative to politics since my return to this country, nor do I believe I ever shall. Politics I have done with, and I thank God." There are many loyalists who make big contributions to the U.S. in other ways. So Samuel Seabury is one example. If you have listened to the musical Hamilton, he is one of the featured individuals in The Farmer Refuted, because he and Hamilton got into a pamphlet war as the revolution was beginning. And Seabury he's a big-time loyalist. He's a chaplain to a loyalist regiment. But he decides to stay in the U.S. He goes to Connecticut at the end of the revolution. And one of the challenges for members of the Church of England in the U.S. once the revolution's over is that the Church of England is the Church of England, and the king is the head of the Church of England. And so that becomes a problem, and Seabury goes to England, and he's able to actually, the English bishops won't consecrate him as a bishop, but he goes to Scotland and gets some Scottish bishops to consecrate him with the apostolic succession, and he becomes the first bishop of the American Episcopal Church. He comes back to the U.S., and helps establish the American Episcopal Church, which is the American version of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So in some ways, he's the founder of the Episcopal Church. Occasionally, accusations of loyalism would surface in future years. There's a case, for example, as late as 1810, when one former loyalist who was a Federalist ends up being appointed a justice of the peace in the Mohawk Valley of New York. Local Democratic Republicans, who are the party opposing Federalists, they end up attacking this appointment. This guy's name is Dirk Gardner, and they vilify Gardner, saying Gardner was, quote, "as rank a Tory to this day as ever lived, that he was mollassed for want of tar and feather during the Revolution, and Gardner in 1776 would have shot Washington had it been in his power." So occasionally, accusations of Toryism, especially against Federalists, crop up even into the early 19th century. There are also some loyalists who have a hard time fully reconciling themselves to the new order the revolution created. In 1790, Cadwallader Colden II, who has a great name, very good colonial name, Cadwallader, he works hard to reintegrate, but he succeeds, but he still isn't really sure the revolution was the right thing. So in this letter here, which I looked at the Library of Congress, he writes to Peter Van Schack, the other loyalist I talked about earlier, and he says, he calls the revolution a cursed rebellion, and says, "I can't yet help thinking we might have been happier at this day had we remained as we were." Although he did say he hoped he was wrong about that. So, big picture, the revolution was a civil war, and I think loyalists provide a pretty remarkably successful example of conflict resolution through this peace process. There are many laws discriminating against them. There is a violent war. There's some violence in the immediate aftermath of the war. But within a few years, things cool down, and again, by 1790, most loyalists are full members of society once again. They're equal citizens. And why is this? I think, one, the most militant loyalists have somewhere to go. Most of them end up in Canada, some in Great Britain, a handful in other places. Therefore, most of the loyalists who remain are more moderate and passive in their ideological outlook. Three, there's the lack of demographic, geographic distinctions. And I should say with number two, that ties into like Federalists helping them reintegrate as well. Three, lack of demographic, geographic distinctions. And then four, that community-centered reintegration approach, where loyalists work hard to distance themselves from the violence of the war, emphasize they have been nonviolent during the conflict, and reach out to old friends and family who can help them sort of pass back into society over the years. And that's really, I think, are the keys to why this first American Civil War ends much more peacefully than a lot of civil wars do. So thank you, and I can take questions now if there are any. Dylan?
How successful were the Loyalists
I think it depends what part of the war you're talking about. So in the early stages of the war, Loyalists don't play a big military component. By the latter stages of the war, they're actually really, really important. So especially when you get to the Southern campaign. So the British attack Savannah in late 1778, and that's the beginning of the Southern strategy for the British trying to take over the South. At that point, the British are really tapping into a lot of Loyalist support. They're raising lots of regiments, they're relying on Loyalist militia. And the South, they're very important to Loyalist British military strategy. Obviously not that successful in the long run, but they're important to how the British are conducting their operations throughout the war, but most especially in the latter stages of the war, I would say.
Did some of the Loyalists end up fleeing out west? I know they went up to Canada, but did some of them end up fleeing out west? Or kind of like as the nation like evolved and stuff, and like.
Yeah, I mean like Mississippi Valley, that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are some who do that. So actually, there are a lot of Loyalists who take refuge in Indian country throughout the war. So a lot of Loyalists in the north were living in like western New York, the Iroquois Confederacy. There are Loyalists in the south taking refuge in the Cherokee, in like what's now Tennessee. And other Loyalists in the Carolinas too go even further west, and they end up out in like what's now Mississippi and Louisiana, taking refuge in that area, because part of Louisiana was controlled by the British, was there as West Florida. And you have one group of Loyalists out in the Natchez area, and refugees who end up living in the Choctaw in Mississippi, who will form this like Loyalist sort of partisan detachment. It actually will attack a Spanish outpost in Arkansas. It's the only engagement in Arkansas during the Revolutionary War. A small one when Loyalists attack the Spanish Arkansas post a little bit southeast of Little Rock.
Maybe you already explained this and I missed it, but I was wondering, so during that period when every state was applying sanctions to Loyalists, how was exactly decided if a person was a Loyalist or not? Because it seems like a very ambiguous thing to determine.
It's very hard it was hard to enforce. So when it came to voting, for example, it was the job of the poll inspectors supposed to do it. So the poll inspectors are going to be locals. They'll have a general idea of who in the neighborhood was a Loyalist, and they're supposed to kind of run interference on Loyalists who are voting. So in that case, it's the inspectors. When it comes to being a lawyer, you have to pass the bar exam. So there'd be people who would be overseeing that process who would be able to block Loyalists if they thought they were Loyalists. It is very subjective. That's one of the problems with enforcing it. One of the reasons why it's really hard to enforce. It's generally pretty subjective to whoever is really running the process, whether they want to determine that person was a Loyalist or not. Some things like land confiscation are a little bit easier to determine. So what happens in that case, when New York passes land confiscation, they have 59 Loyalists who they identify specifically by name, and they automatically lose the property right then and there. And then they have this process set up where if somebody went to the courts and gave a deposition saying they knew somebody else was a Loyalist and they provide some evidence, that person's land would be confiscated unless they could provide counter evidence they weren't a Loyalist. So, for example, there are cases of like Americans who are taken as prisoners of war. They're in Canada for a while. They see one of their neighbors that was a Loyalist. They're released in exchange. They go back to New York. They go to the courts and say, "My neighbor John Smith, I saw him when I was a prisoner in Canada. He was wearing a Loyalist military uniform. He's a Loyalist," and then his land might be confiscated. So it really depends on which law you're talking about, but it is subjective in a lot of cases.
And were there official lists of names that public officer were reducting list of Loyalists?
Yeah, if you're allowed to be confiscated, the law was you had to publish the name in the newspaper, which is how I was able to find all these names. So all these individuals who were accused of being Loyalists had their names published in the paper and were said, "Come to the court by date, whatever the date is, ABC, and if you don't come by then, you lose your land," effectively.
And could they raise a case and say, "No, I'm not a Loyalist," and bring evidence to the
They could do that. In my experience, experience, most of them didn't do it because they were loyalists and didn't have good evidence to stop themselves, to prevent their land from being confiscated. So most of them doesn't happen, but legally they could do that if they wanted to.
Did any of them get the land back later once it died down, or was it a done deal?
For the most part, no. There are maybe a handful of exceptions. For the most part, no. So like that, in 1792, when New York repeals the Bill of Attainder, which was where the confiscation component was included, they specifically say in the act that nobody who lost their land is going to get it back. You're welcome to come back if you want. You're not banished anymore. You're not going to get your land back.
Could you buy it back?
So you could buy it back. And I've actually found cases of loyalists who buy loyalist confiscated land that even isn't their own. But one of the most interesting effects I think about loyalist land confiscation is that a lot of loyalists, especially in the eastern part of New York, east of the Hudson River, are big landholders. And so the law also says that the first person that will have the right to buy the land is the tenant who lives on the property. And so there's pretty good evidence there's actually a lot of land redistribution in eastern New York as a result. And something like, this is certain counties, something like 20-25% of the land in those counties is redistributed. Mostly passed off to tenants who are living on the property. So the percentage of New Yorkers who own land goes up quite a bit during the war because these big loyalist landholders lose the property and it's effectively redistributed to the tenants.
How were loyalists able to leverage support for the Constitution if they weren't given the right to vote?
So that point, things were dying. Good question, but that point, things are dying down quite a bit. So that's sort of the turning point where loyalists being more active in society again. Also, by the time of the Poughkeepsie Convention, when they're voting on delegates for that law has been repealed. The law that so they couldn't vote, that's been repealed, so they can vote again. And also, there's like sort of grassroots activism, I would call it. So there are loyalist groups that form sort of local Federalist societies across New York. And they pass resolutions and arguments in favor of the Constitution, for example, and they publish them in the paper. So it's like sometimes it's through public persuasion, sometimes it is through voting through members of the Poughkeepsie Convention. But I go back to kind of what I mentioned in earlier in the talk, which is that New York as a whole is a very anti-federalist state. It is, if there was a popular vote, it certainly would have been, they would have picked the Constitution. And so in some ways, a very crucial part of that coalition, the relatively small Federalist part of the population that helps just get the ball across the finish line when it comes to getting it ratified. Which again, it wouldn't have happened if the 10 other states hadn't already ratified it. There's kind of momentum building for ratification.
So for the 60,000 loyalists who went up into Ontario, was that 60,000 total, or does that include people who went up like to Nova Scotia and the Maritimes as well, or is that just into Upper Canada?
So 60,000 loyalists who left. Period. The Maritimes is probably somewhere around like maybe 35,000 who are the Maritimes, primarily to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, with some to Prince Edward Island too. And then Ontario and Canada is less. That's maybe like 8,000 or so. So if you look at all the loyalists who leave the U.S., something like 2/3 go to what is now Canada. But look at loyalists in the northern states, it's much higher than 2/3. Like in New York, I mean, it's probably like 95, 97, 98% who go to Canada. There's a small number who go to Britain. But in the South, it's different. A lot of Southern loyalists end up in the Caribbean. So there's a little more geographic diversity down there.
And when the loyalists went up to Canada, did they ever end up fighting the French in Quebec, or was that like were they loyal? So they were loyal to the English government, so they didn't want to participate in the American Revolution. But did they end up? Were they still loyal when they were essentially fighting? Did they fight the French in Canada?
Like French Canadians?
Yeah.
No, I would say there is a lot of political infighting. So when loyalists get there, living in what now is Ontario, it was the province of Quebec back then. So they were living under French civil law, living under where French is basically the official language, living under the Catholic Church being everywhere. They don't like that. And so as soon as they get there, they'll be agitating to not be in the same province as the French. South Canada is created because loyalists don't want to be in a French society. And so they created the dividing line just east of Montreal, just west of Montreal, where loyalist settlement started and French Canadian settlement kind of died down. And so they don't fight them, but they do intentionally create a different political entity to have their own British laws and not have French laws instead, have their own British customs opposed to French customs.
I think whenever you hear people sort of talk about the Founding Fathers, there's like two different strains where some people say that the Founding Fathers are really motivated by like Enlightenment ideals and this new type of philosophy, and then a lot of times it's also they're very wealthy businessmen, and their revolution is motivated because their business interests are somehow entangled in whatever's going on with these laws from Parliament. Would you say that the loyalists are mostly materially motivated or ideologically motivated?
I think there's a wide scope. I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think most people also tend to be motivated by multiple factors. I wouldn't say they're mutually exclusive either. You can be motivated both by ideology and also by self-interest in some form. They don't have to be mutually reinforcing. Maybe you aid with ideology because it helps you out financially. So I think it's a combination of both. They're definitely like very ideological loyalists. I'd say in particular, leading members of the Church of England can be very ideological about their loyalism. Common loyalists, they're I don't think they'll be able to explain their ideology to you, but maybe they're really attached to the idea of the king, and so they really love the king, and they can't accept not being part of his realm anymore. So I think there's a wide scope. It's not any one thing. It's like like you said on the American side, the founders, people who join the Continental Army. There's a very wide range of reasons why people are doing that. It's hard to boil down to one or the other. So I think it's just a combination of different factors that influence people's decisions.
Respect for time, let's do one more question.
Ed?
The use of the term Tory is very interesting. Do you see any kind of links with sort of the earlier conflict in the 17th century during the English Civil War, where you have like in the mid-Atlantic states, the Tory, it's an actual conflict between the supporters of the king and supporters of the Parliament, sort of the Cromwellian era.
Like, do they see themselves as anti-Semitic?
Do you see kind of some kind of link to that, with the two groups, the Patriot group and the, they're labeling them Tories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think on the Patriot side, they're doing that on purpose to try to delegitimize them in the eyes of the population at large. They never call them, because they call them loyalists. Loyalty is a virtue, so that doesn't really work well as an insult. Call them Tories, they're sort of the old bad conservatives from 100 years earlier. So Tory is definitely a way to delegitimize them. And Americans were very well read on the British history, so they knew what Tory meant, they knew what Tories were based on their knowledge of British history. So I'd say it's really just a term that's almost like a strategy to try to delegitimize opposition to the revolution. Loyalists themselves, they almost never call themselves Tories. Early in the war, a lot of them call themselves friends of government. Then as the war goes on, you begin seeing terms like royalist and loyalist appear. And eventually loyalist wins out. Always been relying with loyalists that are royalists, but those are the two big ones as the war evolves. And eventually loyalists is the big term by the end of the war. But they pretty clearly don't identify ever as Tory. That's just a patriot insult to try to delegitimize them by connecting them to this disreputable part of British history, English history.
Let's give him one last round of applause. Thank you all for coming. Don't forget there are a bunch of events happening tomorrow on campus, so